On April 1, 1807, Ohio enacted a law that prohibited black people from testifying in cases where white people were involved. In the early 1800s, the black population of Ohio grew exponentially as black people gained freedom and escaped enslavement. In response, Ohio's legislature launched a coordinated campaign to prevent black people from settling in the state. Ohio's black laws, enacted between 1804 and 1807, restricted the movement and freedom of black people already living in the state, denied all black people the right to public education, and required black residents to register with local authorities and prove their freedom on demand. Other laws prevented black people from competing financially with white residents. One law required black people to post a $500 bond guaranteed by two white men within 20 days of moving to the state. The 1807 testimony law built on these racial restrictions and prohibited any black person from testifying against white people who committed crimes against them or others. The law made black people vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. White landowners took land and other resources from black people by filing frivolous suits they knew they could win, since black people could not defend themselves through testimony. In one 1841 case, a black woman who witnessed two white men murder her husband was barred from testifying in court. Ohio's testimony law remained in effect for decades and had long-term consequences that left black people unprotected by laws upholding basic rights. On March 6, 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in Dred Scott v. Sanford that black people were not American citizens and could not sue in courts of law. Dred Scott was a black man who had been enslaved for years by a military physician named Dr. John Emerson. While he was enslaved, Mr. Scott traveled and resided with Dr. Emerson in several states where slavery was illegal. They eventually settled in Missouri. When Dr. Emerson died, Mr. Scott and his wife Harriet sought freedom in the Missouri state courts. The Scotts argued that because they had lived in territories where slavery was illegal, their enslavement had been voided. But the court ruled against them and authorized Dr. Emerson's widow to continue enslaving them, as enslavement was legal in Missouri. When she later passed her estate, including the Scotts, to her brother, Dred Scott sought freedom in federal court, resulting in the United States Supreme Court's decision, which held that black people were not citizens even when born in the United States. The ruling kept the Scotts legally enslaved, along with millions of black people born in the United States. Dred and Harriet Scott were eventually freed by a subsequent enslaver after the decision. Harriet Scott lived for another 20 years, but Mr. Scott died of tuberculosis just a few months after gaining freedom. On November 10, 1898, over 2,000 armed white people descended on Wilmington City Hall and forced black and white elected officials to resign in a coup. At the time, Wilmington, North Carolina was home to a prosperous community of black business owners, doctors, lawyers, and politicians. In the days leading up to the 1898 election, white groups known as red shirts organized to intimidate black voters. Infuriated by the result of a biracial government, a mob of white men waged a campaign of terror against black residents. Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and U.S. congressman, led the mob and declared that he would choke the current of the Cape Fear River with black bodies. Armed white rioters destroyed black businesses and killed hundreds of black residents. The Daily Record, a black newspaper that had previously denounced lynchings of black people, was the first business the mob targeted. President William McKinley declined to intervene, leaving Wilmington's black residents to fend for themselves. Thousands of black citizens fled the city in the wake of the insurrection, which dramatically altered the racial demographics of the city. Colonel Waddell, who led the insurrection, was appointed Wilmington's new mayor. Racial hierarchy was codified as state policy for half a century to follow.
On May 3, 1913, California enacted the Alien Land Law, which prevented Asian immigrants from owning land. There is a long history of anti-Asian bias in America. In the early 1900s, thousands of Japanese immigrants settled in California. Many arrived directly from Hawaii, where they had been subjected to indentured labor on the island's sugarcane plantations. A large number of immigrants began farming in California, and by 1915, Japanese farmers grew 75% of the vegetables that Los Angeles residents consumed. But the 1913 Alien Land Law and similar laws passed in 1920 and 1923 barred Asian immigrants, their American-born children, and even corporations controlled by Asian immigrants from owning land. 16 states followed California's model and passed anti-Asian legislation. Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Idaho, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Minnesota, Montana, New Mexico, Oregon, Texas, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming all enacted discriminatory laws restricting Asian people's rights to hold land in the United States. In 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed various versions of the discriminatory land laws and upheld every single one. Most of these racially discriminatory state laws remained in place until the 1950s, and some even longer. Kansas and New Mexico did not repeal their provisions until the early 2000s. Though it was not enforced, a racially biased land law remained in Florida's Constitution until 2018.
On February 2, 1909, Pittsburgh police officers raided a predominantly black neighborhood and arrested over 200 black men for being unemployed. Days earlier, the city had increased its police presence after vague reports of numerous attacks upon white women. There was little evidence of attacks and there was no ongoing investigations, but police immediately began harassing black men. Officers raided every black home in Heron Hill, arresting any black man who could not provide proof of employment. The men were charged with vagrancy, and the next day many were sent to the workhouse and consigned to forced labor. The men had not committed any crime. Like many white people in the city, they were simply unemployed. After the Civil War, Southern states passed black codes, discriminatory policies used to criminalize and re-enslave black people. For offenses like vagrancy, loitering, or not carrying proof of employment, black people were subjected to criminal prosecution. As black people migrated north to escape racial terror lynchings, northern cities adopted laws and similar policies. Mass arrests are just one example of the way black people were unlawfully abused, mistreated, and condemned to forced labor decades after the formal end of slavery in America. Today, a presumption of guilt and dangerousness too often makes people of color vulnerable to wrongful arrest and criminal prosecution.
On June 16, 1944, a 14-year-old boy named George Stinney was executed in the electric chair in Columbia, South Carolina. 3 months earlier, 2 white girls disappeared and were later found dead. George Stinney, a black boy, had volunteered to help and joined the search party with his father. He mentioned to a bystander that he had seen the girls briefly the day they went missing. Though there was no evidence connecting George to the murders, he was immediately arrested and subjected to hours of interrogation alone. The sheriff later claimed that George confessed to killing the girls, but no written or signed statement existed. George's father was fired from his job and his family was forced to flee after receiving death threats. Nearly a month later, George Stinney faced a sham trial virtually alone. No black people were allowed inside the courthouse, and his court-appointed attorney did not call a single witness to aid George's case. The sheriff's testimony about George's alleged confession was the only evidence presented. An all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes before convicting George Stinney of murder, and the judge sentenced the 14-year-old child to death. Despite appeals from black advocacy groups and evidence that George was innocent, Governor Olin Johnson refused to intervene. During the execution, state officials forced George to sit on a book. At just 90 pounds, he was too small for the straps of the electric chair. 14-year-old George Stinney remains the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century.
On December 18, 1952, Georgia Governor Herman Talmadge announced, "There is only one solution in the event segregation is banned by the Supreme Court, and that is abolition of the public school system." Earlier that year, Georgia passed a bill defunding any school that enrolled both black and white students. Governor Talmadge proposed a state-subsidized, segregated private school system, as private facilities were essentially legally immune to integration litigation. Under the plan, existing public schools would be leased for $1 to a suitable man or woman who would operate them as private, white-only schools. White students would receive a $200 annual tuition subsidy from the state. Nothing was specified for black students. Under a similar plan in Virginia, black students lost 5 years of schooling until the Supreme Court intervened. Even after racial exclusion in education was declared unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education, Southern states violently resisted integration. "Blood will run in the streets of Atlanta," Governor Talmadge declared. "We intend to maintain separate schools in Georgia one way or another." 10 years after the Brown decision, less than 3% of black children in the South attended school with white students. Today, many schools remain racially segregated, and predominantly white schools continue to get more resources than schools that serve mostly students of color.
On July 11, 1954, white residents in Indianola, Mississippi formed the first White Citizens Council to organize resistance to racial integration. After the United States Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional, a Mississippi judge urged white residents to resist the decision. Inspired by the judge's words, a white man named Robert Patterson called for a meeting of concerned white men and women. They soon formed the first White Citizens Council. Integration represents darkness, regimentation, totalitarianism, communism, and destruction, he wrote. Segregation represents the survival of the white race. Within 2 years, active councils were operating across 30 states with tens of thousands of members. Business, religious, and civic leaders defended white supremacy and used social pressure and economic retaliation to intimidate and coerce black and white people who supported integration. As a result, black people and civil rights activists were denied loans, purged from voter rolls, and fired from their jobs. In South Carolina, dozens of black people were fired or evicted from their homes after the signing of a pro-integration petition. In Mansfield, Texas, council members with guns blocked black children from entering their school. People who participated in sometimes violent resistance to integration were never held accountable for their lawlessness, which continues to impact communities to this day.
On August 13, 1955, a group of white men in Brookhaven, Mississippi, killed a 63-year-old black man named Lamar Smith, a World War I veteran and voting rights activist who had been working to register African American voters in his community. With a local runoff election approaching, Mr. Smith planned to help black residents fill out absentee ballots so they could vote without facing violence at the polls. As Mr. Smith arrived at the Lincoln County Courthouse on August 13th, a group of white men shot and killed him on the courthouse lawn in front of dozens of witnesses, including the sheriff, Robert E. Case, who permitted one assailant to leave the crime covered in blood. No arrests were made. 3 white suspects were later arrested, but a grand jury made up of 20 white men declined to indict them for murder. The case was eventually dismissed and no one was held responsible for the killing. Mr. Smith's murder was one of many racially motivated attacks in Mississippi in 1955, including the murder of civil rights leader George Lee, the abduction and killing of Emmett Till, and the near-fatal shooting of Gus Courts. Throughout the next decade and beyond, Mississippi would be known as one of the most violent and deadly environments in the fight for equal rights. Even after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the legacy of racial violence in Mississippi, where no one was held accountable, continues to burden many communities of color, while new restrictive voting laws also create great concern about the commitment to equal voting rights.
On October 28, 1958, police arrested 2 black children and jailed them for months for playing a game with a white girl in Monroe, North Carolina. That morning on the playground, a white girl kissed on the cheek 2 black boys who were 8 and 9 years old. Their names were David Simpson and James Hanover Thompson. When the girl later mentioned the game to her father, he grabbed his shotgun and gathered a mob of white men to go to James's home, intent on lynching the 2 children and their mothers. The boys weren't home when the mob arrived, but police quickly found them, confronted them with weapons drawn, took them into custody, and severely beat them. Local officials held the children in jail for 6 days and prevented them from speaking with their parents or attorneys. The boys did not know why they were being arrested, and when they were taken to the police station, they were told that they were being accused of rape. While the boys were detained, a group of police officers broke into their cell wearing white sheets to intimidate them. Local white residents burned a cross on the Thompsons' lawn, fired shots into their home, and even killed James's dog. Evelyn Thompson and Jenny Simpson, the 2 boys' mothers, were fired from their jobs. Denied attorneys, James and David were both charged with assault and molestation and sentenced to indefinite terms at the state reformatory. More than 3 months later, and only after the case drew widespread attention, North Carolina's governor pardoned the boys and released them. Neither the governor nor the court admitted to any wrongdoing, and no officials ever apologized for arresting, beating, and jailing the boys, or for traumatizing the entire Black community.